Hi, everybody. This is Jay Halfond from the Higher Education Program at Boston University's Wheelock College, and I'm very pleased to welcome Michael Carroll as part of our Conversations with Experts. Mike is the Executive Director of the Hollings Center for International Dialogue, and we've crossed paths several times in my career and his career. I've participated in several of his programs at the Hollings Center, which he can describe a little bit more, but even as importantly, I've known Mike as an alumnus of our higher education program at Boston University, where he was also a staff member of the institution as well. So welcome, Mike. It's nice to have you here.
Well, thanks, Jay. Thanks for having me.
And anxious to get into some of the aspects of your background and also to hear not just what the Hollings Center does, but how your perspective on higher education globally. I should have also mentioned that Mike's guest lectured in my global higher education class as well. Mike, tell me sort of how you got to where you are in terms of, I see where you went to school. I can sort of, I see that you then went to work at Boston University and simultaneously, concurrently got your degree. And I'm curious to hear how that all progressed. And then of course to hear how, not only how wonderful your program was at BU, but also how valuable it proved to be, I hope.
Oh, absolutely. It's actually really it's actually very important when you're doing dialogue to actually understand education, because that's really what it kind of comes down to in many respects. Anyway, so as Jay mentioned, I did both work at BU and also I'm an alumnus of the Wheelock program and the higher ed administration program. And I started at BU right after graduating from Michigan in the BAT lab, actually, the late Tom Coons. He was my first boss at BU, and I was just looking for a gig, and he gave me one. After a couple of years, I got pillaged to a couple of other different departments within CAS, and they had me set up or work with the administration on several initiatives, one being the Institute for the Study of Muslim Societies and Civilizations at BU. And over time, I also did the American Institute of Afghanistan Studies. I helped with the Center for the Study of Asia. Basically, if it were an international program, they came in, they asked me to get the administration set up. And it was during that time, actually during the last major crisis that really hit higher education, the economic downturns of 2008 to about 2010 or so, where I went and decided to further my education by getting my degree in higher ed administration here at BU. So that's how I ended up there. And then in about 2007 to 2012 or so, through some of the stuff that I was doing here at BU, I got involved with the Hollings Center for International Dialogue on several programs that we were doing on Afghanistan at the time. And they came to me with an offer I couldn't refuse in 2013 to actually, I'll never forget the call. He calls up and says, "I'm moving on." That's great. Now, anything I could do to help? Yeah, you could apply. so they in turn pillaged me again. So it was actually a really great experience to then, transition directly from higher education and academia aspects of foreign policy and international relations. So it was a nice, interesting transition. And again, my background in higher ed really is IR because we're educating each other. So some of the various tactics and various was actually surprisingly preparatory for a lot of the work that I do today. So I hope that's a satisfactory enough answer for you. But
yeah.
Yes, I've had many jobs. My staff always jokes about how many hats I've worn.
So tell us a little bit more about the Hollings Center, and because it has a very interesting history and status, kind of quasi-government, but somewhat detached from that, and of course named after somebody who is quite memorable in Congress as well as in the field of international relations. So it enjoys a unique status, but probably is also a little bit precarious because of that unique status.
Exactly. It's one of those blessing and a curse kind of situations.
Right.
But the short story is that back in 2003, Senator Fritz Hollings of South Carolina, a pretty famous and quite a character of a senator, was on a congressional delegation in the aftermath of the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And after touring the region, meeting with some people, he became convinced that one of the things that needed to happen was greater dialogue between people of Muslim majority nations and the United States. And that if there were going to be any furtherance of peace or even basic understanding of multiple sides on multiple issues, there needed to be a place for dialogue. And this coincided at the same time that there was the old consulate in Istanbul, which is the second oldest diplomatic property that has ever been held by the people of the United States, was being moved to a new complex in Istanbul. So there was I guess you could say, a contingent of former Foreign Service officers and people that really had fallen in love with this place called the Palazzo Corpi. And so you had this kind of marriage of convenience in 2003 of wanting to create a center, but at the same time also wanting to preserve one of the great symbols of our, international diplomatic presence.
Right.
So the center was officially created in 2004 with the broad mission by Congress of fostering dialogue between the United States and people of Muslim majority nations. We've since then been holding dialogue programs and other types of private and public fora on a whole host of different issues that we think are of mutual importance, but also topics that are typically underserved. So we won't often talk about the crises du jour, but we'll tend to look at some of the long-term things that are of importance to many different people around the globe. One of those being higher education. So it's a natural fit from transitioning from one role to another. And since that point, we've hosted, we were about to have our 50th dialogue program this year, but of course, COVID-19 intervened. But we'll have these dialogue programs that serve as the anchor to everything that we do. And they're typically groups of 15 to 25 or so people. Jay, you were a participant in one of those back in 2014. And what we'll do is we'll convene them on certain topics and try to build networks that look at a lot of the issues, challenges, and also try to come up with different mindsets and different solutions across a wide array of spectra. We've held those dialogue programs, I think, in about half a dozen countries now. We've had participation now, I think, from 63 countries in a recent check that we did. So not all of them are Muslim majority, but a lot of them, are. A lot of them have strong Muslim pluralities, and a lot of them have, large populations, even like the United States, that has about 3 million Muslim citizens. So we do a lot of, these types of programs, and like higher education, everything got disrupted this year. So, but we're figuring out a way to manage it through, just like higher ed is.
Yeah, it's it must be so disruptive. Istanbul itself, of course, is so symbolic in so many ways. Geographically, exactly where it's located. If you look one way, it's Europe. The other way is Asia. So it very much is sort of a melting pot. And you have staff in Istanbul as well. And
that's right.
So, but you just can't get there from here right now.
Exactly.
That's the problem. So let's talk about some of your observations about global higher education, especially in Muslim countries in the Middle East. It's changed so dramatically in the last couple of decades. And is it moving in its own direction? Is it mimicking the West? Is it producing the kind of quality and excellence we'd be looking for in the Western world, or is it sort of the Wild West, but in the Middle East, in a sense?
If we were having this conversation 10 years ago,
yeah,
I would say it was the Wild West.
Yeah,
and that the intent 10 years ago was really to mimic or to import, in many cases, Western higher education into a lot of the countries.
Yeah.
Now, I think what's happening is you're seeing a world where parallel tracks and systems are being put into place. And it's not just the Middle East. Like, we've also done a lot of higher education work in South Asia and Southeast Asia as well. And what's really fascinating is that while there was definitely, I think, a movement to kind of import the Western or even the American standards into higher education abroad, that's really changed. And what will remain to be seen, I think, is what the impact of COVID-19 will have on where that trajectory was going.
Yeah.
I think if you want to get into like a kind of a specific, difference,
Sure.
you have some countries that have very well developed education systems like Turkey. It has a mixture of public and private universities. It has a academic tradition that goes back into the 19th century and links to the United States in the higher ed that go back to the 19th century. And the current government there under the AKP party was investing heavily in higher education right up until what happened with COVID and some of the other recent economic issues going on in Turkey.
But also before that, they were cracking down on academic freedom at the same time.
I will have to measure my words on that, of course, but
okay.
But no, but that's true. And you have this weird existence in Turkey where there's this kind of there is areas where academic freedom is totally intact, and then other areas where it's definitely being damaged.
Yes.
It's interesting when you look at the private universities in Turkey how much leeway they actually do have, but that being said, most of the investment by Turkey in recent years has been into public institutions. There was a platform in the AKP party to put basically a college in every single province. And they went from, having about a few dozen higher education institutions to several hundred just in the last decade.
Yeah.
So you have this attempt at, kind of explosive expansion,
yeah.
while at the same time you're having this kind of contradictory affront to academic freedom.
Yeah.
And now an economic crisis brought on by things like COVID that may impact the ability to meet that demand.
Yeah.
And then you go to the Gulf states and you have a totally different picture.
Totally different. So how has COVID? We hear about, of course, the impact in Iran, but I don't know what's happening in the other countries in that region, the Persian Gulf, Turkey, etc. Is it truly a pandemic, and that everybody is suffering pretty comparably?
I think it's just like everywhere else in the world, just like within the United States, you have areas that have been hit really hard and then areas that seem to have averted the worst, at least on the first round of this.
Yeah.
Turkey was one of the countries that was hit pretty hard at the beginning. I think while it has definitely subsided, they had over 150,000 cases, and they were peaking about the same time as the United States.
Yeah.
You have the case of Iran, of course, another country with a pretty diverse academic system.
Yeah.
Where they were hit pretty hard earlier than the U.S., and they may actually be experiencing the second peak now, or they might be entering a second peak right now, based on some numbers I was looking at. But then you have countries like Jordan that went into like a very quick and very, dare I say, strict lockdown very early on. So their case numbers were pretty minimal. But of course, they shut everything down, including their higher education systems. So you had this kind of like a hodgepodge where, some of the Gulf countries were very strict. Jordan was very strict. Egypt, not so much. Turkey, not so much. Iran did, but they had a different timing. And it's disrupted everybody's academic calendars. A lot of exams that are really critical to getting into the state systems in a lot of these countries were postponed. That's going to tip the academic calendar in the wrong way. Some countries have not allowed their institutions to resume yet. Some of the North African institutions like Tunisia and Morocco, they're probably going to be shut down for a little bit longer. They may even lose the fall semester, the way things are going. But we'll see. Overall, I mean, this is the first time, at least in my experience, where we've kind of witnessed a global cessation of higher education in most respects. International exchange is all shut down. Different countries and different regions are trying to handle the problem in different ways. And the trigger for the crisis may be the same globally, but what actually is instituting the crisis, the effect is different in a lot of these different areas.
Yeah.
So it remains to be seen when a lot of these countries, particularly the Middle East and North Africa, start getting back up and running, and what that's going to look like afterwards. Most of those, in places like Egypt, the Gulf states, their higher ed systems are very subsidized. And you look at, like the price of oil. The Gulf states right now are in real trouble. The price war between OPEC and Russia, plus the pandemic effects, people are literally paying to get rid of their oil.
Yes.
And as a result of that, you're going to have massive budget deficits in a
Right.
lot of these countries, and they're not going to be able to pay for higher ed.
And they're dealing with social unrest too, because of the migrant workers who can't find jobs, but yet are living in very congested, densely populated areas, and are probably more susceptible to the virus as a result of that. And they're probably, moving throughout countries as well as trying to get back home to their home country. So it's probably a social, economic, and public health mess, I would imagine.
Yeah, and the question is, which do you deal with first?
Right.
And let's not forget there were two very large scale conflicts going on in the MENA region.
Yeah.
Actually, three. Libya, Yemen, and Syria. And you also had there was a lot of protests and civil unrest in places like Iraq, Iran, all of this stuff that was going on before COVID-19 hit.
Right.
So the opportunity for disruption is significant throughout the region.
Yes. So a disease can lead to a ceasefire, I imagine, and in that sense, because you kind of move from one public threat to another threat, in a sense.
Yeah, and that's the thing. There's been talk about what's going to happen in Yemen. If there has been talk about ceasefire, it's been there.
Yeah.
But more what it is that the attention has just shifted away from it, and so that's the case with Syria.
Yeah.
The situation in Libya has definitely gotten into a stalemate with the various powers backing one adjutant or another.
Yeah.
Exactly, so that stuff hasn't really stopped. So even in some of those countries where, like, let's say you could get over the economic or even public health hurdles that would allow you to get your higher ed systems back up and running, like the conflicts are still there, and that's why even as we're dealing with the health crisis, we need to still be talking about how do we resolve some of those conflicts.
Yeah, and American universities have the scale, the history, the endowments to figure out how to manage a transition. I mean, obviously, it's going to be devastating to universities in America, especially in the fall. But I would argue even beyond the fall. But at least they have comprehensive structures in which they've built up, the funds, the reserves. They can invest in the technology that they need to convert the classroom so that remote students can access the classes. Just when you think about the checklist of things you need to survive a pandemic, I doubt many of the schools that have been created in the last 2 decades have those kind of resources.
And even if they did, a lot of those resources are spent on things that you're not using right now.
Right.
So this is very true of a lot of some of the Gulf institutions, is that they've been investing heavily in physical infrastructure, not digital infrastructure or digital curricula or but in physical infrastructure.
Yeah.
If there's a region where I actually thought there might have been some hope, it's just the timing wasn't very good. It's South Asia. There was some interesting. We had a symposium on it last year, and there was the beginnings of a real movement, I think, for curricular development, but also for realizing that in order for those populations in places like Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, that distance ed was going to be a key component in the education of these populations. And so there was the beginning of movements towards that, I think, about 1.5 years ago. And then this hit suddenly and forced everybody on to changing quickly. I'm not exactly sure how well they've adapted yet. We're actually having an event on that later this week just to see how it's going.
I assume internet access is a major issue when you have a population of 1 billion in India. How do you reach even a small segment, a small percentage of that population?
Right. And let's be honest. A lot of the way we're at least thinking about digital education right now, it's very bandwidth heavy. You're using a lot of video, you're using a lot of audio, there's a lot of traffic back and forth. And in some of these countries, they're in a good position because they kind of leapfrog wired broadband, and went straight to like 3G and 4G technology.
Yes.
but it's not all there yet. You're still talking about, the places where you probably most want that kind of penetration still don't have the speed connections, even via
Right.
cellular towers, to do that. So how do you redevelop your curriculum and your distance learning models so that you can actually account for that? And that's the discussions they were having before all of this hit.
Yes, and of course, in a just-in-time mode, as you realize the impact of the virus. So when the schools shut down in the middle of what we call the spring semester, the students, I assume, couldn't go remote. The school simply shut.
Yeah, in many cases they did. Now there were some, like some of the private universities in Turkey, I know, did pivot to an extent, but just like here in the United States, it was like the emergency pivot. Like let's just get it across the line at the end of the semester. Not really thinking about what it takes to actually build an online curriculum. And I come from a family I have a bunch of teachers in my family. Yeah. And they're still trying to devise their lessons for, the summer semester. And
they probably had about 3 days notice in which to start the process.
About a week at best. And of course, here in the US, there's now this lot of hedging language, which is, we're hoping, we intend to, and still making everybody plan for the back end.
It's going to be something. And there's so many things to say about our concern about that and how it's going to take place. But you refer to the private schools, and just so those listening would understand, private means something very different in other parts of the world, and often has a different status as well. In America, for example, we're used to our oldest and most prestigious universities being private, and having a nonprofit status and being somewhat removed from government, and that other schools and the public movement was largely trying to emulate what had already been established on the private side. The rest of the world sort of does it the other way around in many respects. And in many, I'm overgeneralizing, but when you say private, those are not the old venerable schools that we're talking about.
No, and in fact, a lot of them are. Some of them are. And again, in like established educational systems like Turkey, some of those private schools have been around for 125 years. Or you have like an AUB in Lebanon or something like that, or an AUC in Egypt, and they're very much.
But the A stands for what?
American.
Okay.
Exactly. So like, the American University of Beirut and the American University of Cairo. Yeah. So there are some that, but again, those are pretty few and far between. And in fact, a lot of the American universities in this region, outside of those two, were established within the last 10 to 15 years, again, because they wanted to import aspects of the American higher education system into their country. So you have like AU Afghanistan, you have AU Suleimania in Iraq, in Iraqi Kurdistan. Yeah. So that's the normal kind of thing, where they're more recent, so they're a little bit more on the cutting edge. But they're not like these well-established liberal arts schools. In many cases, they're almost like trade schools, where it's like, okay, you have your College of Business, your College of this, your faculty of, et cetera, and they're very much focused on the national mission for like economic diversification.
It's manpower development. It's very much
exactly
on filling a need that the public institutions are unable to fill.
Precisely. And that doesn't mean that, again, the elitism sometimes is still, consistent throughout. The elites will send their students, their children to some of those private institutions if they don't send them abroad, which is also what happens more often in that case. But again, it's definitely the newer schools with some of the newer, not just newer infrastructure and that type of thing, but also kind of the newer curricular approaches. Are those private institutions?
Yeah.
The state institutions have been around, as in many cases, 60, 70 years, depending on what it is, and have bent or changed with political winds, just like some of the state schools in our country too.
Yeah.
So it's those are the few and far between, really. And I mean, you also have for-profits like correspondence type schools and things like that in a lot of countries, but private is definitely different in that part of the world. Yeah,
and tends to be, as you say, newer and more specialized, whereas universities tend to be older and more comprehensive, and of course much cheaper. So if you're from a wealthy family, but you do not get into a large established public university, your parents can afford the privates.
Correct.
How do they tend to compete with the idea of going to America and we're going to Australia or going to England?
Well, I'm sorry. I think that's going to be the real interesting thing to see over the next year and a half to 2 years. Is, you know, it pretty much, if you were a member of the upper echelon of a particular country, if you were sending your children, your students to the United States, to you know, European institutions, to the UK, to Australia. And again, I think there's a differentiation between the various regions that I cover. I think in the Middle East, what's really going to be interesting is I think it is going to become more regionally centric. Particularly in the Gulf states, because again, they put a lot of money into that infrastructure. They're going to have to figure out a way to support that infrastructure. And the states in the Gulf in particular have been adopting some pretty rigorous quality assurance standards in the last few years, I think, as part of their economic diversification programs. So the kind of negative stigma of going to an institution in your home country in that region is not what it used to be. In addition, they have other side of the system, like, you know, places like Egypt, where going into the public universities was kind of like your pathway to the public service sector job that, you know, is seen as the blanket of economic security in a lot of these areas. I expect that demand to increase, given the economic fallout of COVID-19 and the global economic slowdown that's the result. So I think you're going to see more demand to go into those in the MENA region.
So in general, you're more likely to stay within your own country because it's more reputable now to do so, as well as obviously safer and less constraining in terms of, you know, international policies. But the other thing is, at least in the immediate term, I think there's going to be it's going to be hard to come and study in the United States, the UK, Europe. One of the things that happened after this is that, you know, while I know that Educational Cultural Affairs, for example, at the State Department, which handles things like Fulbright, Hayes, but also plays a role in a lot of these forms called DS 2019s, which are basically get you your J visas and that type of thing. While they're still processing, you know, for these exchange programs, the ability to get your consular appointment to come study in the United States in a lot of places has been totally shut down due to the public health crisis. You know, so it could be a situation where, for, you know, this will impact, at least for the immediate upcoming academic year, how many students are actually come to the United States because of whether or not they could get their appointments, get the SEVIS processing done, you know, get their J visas, their F visas, or whatever. So it might be a disruptive year. And what will be fascinating to see is that will eventually open up. This, you know, it's an important industry to the United States. What will happen when it does open up? Will we have the flood back in, or will it be it's been a year and a half, and now all of a sudden people are realizing that there's an alternative? Where I think that's really going to hit the U.S. hard is students coming in from Southeast Asia, at least in the countries that I've worked with, because they do send a lot of their the youngest and brightest to the U.S. and to Europe and to Australia to study. And that was already starting to tip more towards, you know, building up local educational infrastructure in places like Malaysia and Indonesia. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there. Is this the pivot? It's a very significant industry because we have over 1 million students typically in America coming from other countries, which could be a lot higher if or could have been a lot higher, I should say, in the past. And that 1 million, it's about 25% of worldwide mobility among students. So U.S. has always been the country of choice. Now, there's a higher percentage that go to Australia, a higher percentage within Australia itself. But to your point, it's fascinating to think about if in the meantime, students are forced to stay and study in country and the schools have been getting somewhat better and more reputable, maybe that will be habit forming in a sense.
It could be.
And over time could actually be a boon to local academic development, and which is from the country's point of view, not a bad thing. From America's point of view, it's terrible. So,
Well, and let's be honest, in the international relations realm, I mean, one of the greatest tools of soft power the United States have is our education system.
yes,
And so, it's basically shut down one of our great soft power tools, if you want to
exactly.
get into realpolitik. But
No,
um,
that's a good point, because I'm sure when you hold your international dialogues and get together people from other countries, they probably compare notes on their American alma maters in many cases.
yes,
So, I went to Michigan, I went to Boston University, I went to Harvard, and because I'm sure that tends to be a common element that prosperous elites and prominent elites probably have in most other countries, and that may go away.
right. And it's not just institutions too. It's things like Fulbright, Hayes, all of these exchange programs that are done obviously on a shorter term, or maybe a semester length or something like that. But visiting professors, visiting fellows, it's a very important component of uh, America's position in international education.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's totally understandable why, it was basically brought to an almost full stop. Particularly in March and April, the timing couldn't have been worse for a lot of these things. But we didn't understand a lot about what was going to happen with the progression of the pandemic. We didn't understand much about the virus itself. We didn't know how long this is going to last. The only one we think we have an answer to is that this is going to last longer than we think. So,
Yeah,
so
well, and of course, many universities, I think, are in somewhat of a state of denial and thinking that if they can make it through Thanksgiving, let's say, it'll be fine. But I'm not sure that we have those kind of public health predictive capabilities that will allow us to be really secure about that. Thinking of how this may affect decision making in other countries, suppose the elite families in other countries who previously would have sent their children to America to study are given the option of those students studying online, studying remotely, perhaps taking Zoom classrooms with a 12-hour time difference, etc. In many countries, are they now more likely to stay in country, or is the American degree so prestigious, so important, such an extrinsic factor in what they want to do that they're willing to compromise the experience for the credential?
I could jokingly say that the one universal thing that I have experienced in all of my international travel has been the desire of the parent to protect the child and give it the best possible opportunities imaginable. So while I do think there will be eventual rebound here, I do think in the immediate medium term, there are going to be a lot of parents and students themselves that are going to look at international travel right now and say, nope, it's just not going to happen. I do think, however, that there will be some rebound in the prestige factor of an American diploma and a desire to reconnect and to re-engage.
Right.
I think that might be one of the great things that comes out of this when this is all said and done, is that there will be a desire to re-engage.
Yeah.
But whether or not it'll be to the level that we're used to, I think is who knows.
Well,
we're living in a world right now where, quite frankly, anything more than 3 weeks out, you should be planning to replan. I mean, that's the kind of situation we find ourselves in right now. I think it's possible that you're going to have international students that are going to just take a gap year that may have been accepted to an American institution, but may take some sort of deferral if those universities will allow them to. And I think it would be wise for American universities to do that.
Yeah.
Is to give them flexibility so that you don't lose these students. I think there are going to be students that might start online, but just like when we're trying to do dialogue programs, virtually, like you're talking about 6, 7, 8, 10, 12-hour time zones. So you might have to develop a curriculum that is not something that requires live instruction, but can be self-taught. And that being said, not every student is going to latch on to doing education this way. Just like some people are better auditory learners or better visual learners, there are going to be students that are going to do better in an in-person environment, students that would be okay in a virtual environment, and some students that might be able to handle the hybridization model. And I think it's going to vary student to student.
Yeah.
So I think there are going to be students that will try to come. I think there are going to be students that are going to hold back and maybe take a year off. I think there are going to be students that are going to try virtual options, and there are going to be students that are going to decide, maybe I take my first year at the University of Sharjah, you know, or something like that. And
see how it goes.
You know, and it may entirely depend on their personal circumstances, but also whether or not even their countries will let them out.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things that's been difficult for my organization right now is that, you know, we typically deal with about our top 38 countries, I guess you could say. We did this analysis of every single one of them to see whether or not we could A, bring participants from those countries to our meetings,
right.
and B, whether we could actually hold the meeting there if we couldn't hold it in Turkey.
Yes.
And the answer to that question is, with the exception of a few, pretty much no on all fronts. And there's entry bans, exit bans, mandatory quarantines, things like that. And while that may ease up, not to sound pessimistic, but I think that may ease up during the summer, the fear of the second wave is really going to, you know, result in either restrictions being put back on at some point, or resulting in people's personal decisions not to engage this fall.
Yes.
And we'll see what happens. I'm often wrong. So we'll see what happens.
We'll see what happens. But of course, it's complicated by the fact that concern about international visitors in America is not simply physiological, it's also political and and security, you know, focused as well. And we have an administration, obviously, that's not been friendly towards international dialogue or towards extending the soft power of America, but in some ways more towards isolating the United States. That could easily not only continue in America, but continue in other countries as well. So we may have kind of a reversion to national identity and stability, and where you don't leave home very much. And I don't know what damage that's going to cause to international dialogue with a capital I and capital D, or lowercase. But I think certainly it's going to be a challenge for the Hollings Center, I imagine, in the future, if in fact there's not an embracing of the idea of that we're all part of the same world.
And that's my big hope out of all of this, is that because we are human beings, and because we like to interact with one another, even when we disagree, even when we squabble, even when we fight, even when we don't speak the same language,
right.
There is going to be, because we're all pent up or restricted,
right.
or I think there's going to be a desire to reconnect. Now, it may not happen fast, you know, and I think I can envision a scenario in the medium term where you have bubbles of interaction between certain countries and you can't interact with other countries.
Right.
But one of the things that I have been impressed with is, you know, on the quasi-governmental level, or even the lower governmental level, or on state levels, there is, despite what may be coming from the high levels of the national government, an understanding that we have to engage.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that I know my organization is going to be working really hard on, regardless of who wins in the November election.
And everything
we have to engage.
And everything you just said describes the United States internally as well.
Mm-hmm.
That
exactly.
that is the thirst for that still, even if it doesn't exist in the White House.
Well, exactly. I think there's going to be, and it's globally. Like, look, the United States can be competitors, we can be cooperators, but it doesn't mean we have to be. It means we need to be present.
Right.
You know, and I think, and again, this is just my bias from doing, you know, international anything for about 15 years now. We need to. It's, you know, we can't just pretend that globalization hasn't happened in the last 40 years.
No.
And
higher education has been the medium for this to a large extent, as you say, and it's the ultimate exercise of, you know, in a sense, soft power. And so if we close the channels of higher education to be able to be this kind of international melting pot, then I think it's going to be much more difficult to achieve.
I agree, and that, because then it only becomes economic or political.
Yeah. Transactional.
It's very transactional, and if anything goes to show you, you know, our global competitors, so for lack of a better term,
Yes.
they know how to use, they are figuring out how to use their levers of soft power.
Yes.
And so we should too, is
Yeah.
what I kind of, and there are a lot of good ones that I think have a lot of greater good for the world if we utilize them, and higher education is a perfect example of that.
Yes, it is.
So, I mean, we'll see what happens.
Well,
Everybody's kind of on pause, I think, for this fall, but
But Mike, to kind of sum up or close up, it sounds like you've had a very exciting career that's been a great learning experience, part of which was kind of fostered by your relationship with Boston University, but then beyond. So it sounds like you sort of enjoyed the roller coaster you've been on in terms of being able to see what's happening in the world and be able to talk to people about it. Is that fair?
It's been a heck of a ride. I've met, the educational experience I received at BU and the exposure I received to whole facets of people from all over the world was instrumental in getting me the exposure that make this kind of crazy roller coaster possible. Now I'm just hoping I can get back on the roller coaster at some point, because I want to get back. I want to get back out there.
Exactly.
And it's certainly been an adjustment, but like all adjustments we manage.
It's approaching 100 days, but which in the context of a lifetime is not that long. It just feels like a very long time.
No. I want the Red Sox back as soon as possible. But if we have to put up with this disruption for a little while longer to make sure that that the engagement can continue, then we'll do everything we can to keep that burner running, so that when we can all come back out again and latch on to the intense desire I believe will happen of us wanting to re-engage with one another on a global level. And that's, I'm looking forward to that day, because I think that's going to be a fun chapter in this whole story.
Mike, that's a perfect way to end it. And it's optimistic, it's upbeat, it's promising, and it's enthusiastic, and it's great to talk with you again. And we'll look forward to staying in touch, and look forward to better days in which we're going to talk about all the great opportunities that we have to actually travel abroad and to interact with our colleagues.
Yeah. Amen. Best way to end it up. And Jay, thanks again for having me here. And this was a pleasure.
Great. Take care of yourself.
Thank you. Bye-bye.